Throughout American history, the power to pardon has been both a tool of mercy and a spark for controversy. Granted solely to the president, this constitutional authority has freed the guilty, absolved the convicted, and at times, ignited fierce debate. Every U.S. president has a power that can change lives. It's one of the few presidential powers that can bypass Congress entirely, allowing the commander-in-chief to grant mercy with the stroke of a pen. And it's called the pardon. They can forgive crimes, free prisoners, or wipe a slate clean. Sounds pretty powerful, right? But with great power comes, well, great controversy. From Gerald Ford's polarizing decision to pardon Richard Nixon, to Bill Clinton's last-minute clemency spree, to the contentious cases of modern presidencies, these decisions have left an indelible mark on the fabric of the nation. But with great power comes great responsibility, and often public outcry. What defines a pardon as just? And when does it cross the line into scandal? This is the story of the most memorable and controversial pardons in presidential history, a journey through forgiveness, power, and the enduring question of justice. So, how did this power come about? And why does it sometimes cause such an uproar? Let's dive into the most memorable and controversial presidential pardons in history, a journey through forgiveness, power, and the enduring question of justice. The pardon power was baked into the Constitution way back in the 1700s. The Founding Fathers borrowed the idea from old-school kings who liked to give people a second chance, but they also knew it could be risky. And boy, were they right. The power to pardon goes all the way back to George Washington. In 1794, he faced the first major test of federal authority, the Whiskey Rebellion. Farmers in Pennsylvania were up in arms, literally, over a new tax on whiskey. Washington sent troops to put down the uprising, but chose to pardon 2 men sentenced to hang for their role in the rebellion. It was the first ever presidential pardon. Washington's goal? To show that the government could be firm, but also merciful. It set a precedent for balancing justice with forgiveness. It was a moment of unity, showing that forgiveness could bring the nation together, and a gesture of reconciliation during the nation's infancy. But as the years passed, the scope of the pardon expanded, and with it, the stakes. James Monroe, another early president, used the pardon power to heal wounds after internal conflicts. During his presidency, tensions with Native American tribes often boiled over. In one notable case, Monroe pardoned 2 Creek warriors sentenced to death, hoping it would foster peace in the region. It was a reminder that forgiveness could sometimes be a tool for diplomacy. The presidential pardon might seem like a grand gesture, reserved for big-name scandals or historic moments, but not every pardon makes the headlines. Some are bold, some are bizarre, and some have stories that are almost too strange to believe. Even Andrew Jackson, a president known for his tough persona, made use of pardons in unexpected ways. He famously pardoned a man convicted of piracy, who had saved a group of stranded sailors. Jackson's reasoning? The man's heroic actions outweighed his past crimes, a rare moment of compassion from a president who rarely backed down from a fight. And in 1830, President Jackson pardoned George Wilson, a man sentenced to death for robbing the U.S. mail. But here's the twist. Wilson refused the pardon, arguing that he didn't deserve it. The courts ruled that a pardon couldn't be forced on someone, and Wilson was eventually executed. Talk about a bizarre case. In 1868, Andrew Johnson issued a blanket pardon to thousands of Confederate soldiers and leaders after the Civil War. It was an olive branch to the South, aimed at reuniting the country. But for many in the North, it felt like a betrayal, a move that let former enemies walk free without consequences. Then there's Warren G. Harding, who pardoned a man named Eugene V. Debs. Debs was a socialist leader convicted of speaking out against World War I. Harding didn't agree with Debs's politics, but he believed in free speech and thought the sentence was too harsh. Fun fact, after his release, Debs was invited to the White House for a visit. Speaking of Harding, let's talk prohibition. Presidents like Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover issued thousands of pardons for bootleggers and moonshiners. These weren't just small-time operations. Some of these pardons were for major alcohol smugglers with connections to organized crime. For presidents, it was less about compassion and more about clearing overcrowded prisons. Presidential pardons aren't just for the famous or infamous. Some of the most interesting cases involve people you've probably never heard of, but their stories are worth telling. From acts of mercy to decisions that left people scratching their heads, these pardons show just how complex and surprising this power can be. Take Franklin D. Roosevelt. He granted clemency to over 3,000 people during his presidency, including a group of prisoners who had participated in a hunger strike at Alcatraz. Roosevelt believed in second chances, but he also knew the power of pardons to improve prison conditions and morale. Then there's Harry Truman, who pardoned a man named Oscar Collazo in 1952. Collazo had tried to assassinate Truman as part of a push for Puerto Rican independence. Truman reduced his death sentence to life in prison, and decades later, Collazo was released. It's one of the more unexpected examples of a president choosing mercy over retribution. And while we're on the topic of quirky pardons, let's not forget the annual tradition of pardoning a turkey. It's been around for decades, but it became official with George H.W. Bush in 1989. These lucky birds get a free pass from the dinner table and a lifetime of fame. In 1974, Gerald Ford made history and enemies when he granted a full, unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon. The Watergate scandal had shaken the nation, and Ford said the country needed to move on. But for many Americans, it felt like Nixon was getting a free pass for breaking the law.
You stated that the theory on which you pardoned Richard Nixon was that he had suffered enough. And I'm interested in that theory because the logical consequence of that is that somebody who resigns in the face of virtually certain impeachment, or somebody who is impeached, should not be punished, because the impeachment or the resignation in face of impeachment is punishment enough. And I wondered whether anybody had brought to your attention the fact that the Constitution specifically states that even though somebody is impeached, that person shall nonetheless be liable to punishment according to law.
Mrs. Holtzman, I was fully cognizant of the fact that the President, on resignation, was accountable for any criminal charges. But I would like to say that the reason I gave the pardon was not as to Mr. Nixon himself. I repeat, and I repeat with emphasis, the purpose of the pardon was to try and get the United States, the Congress, the President, and the American people focusing on the serious problems we have both at home and abroad. And I was absolutely convinced then, as I am now, that if we had had this series, an indictment, a trial, a conviction, and anything else that transpired after that, that the attention of the President, the Congress, and the American people would have been diverted from the problems that we have to solve. And that was the principal reason for my granting of the pardon.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chairman, just before we adjourn this hearing, I again would like to commend the President and thank him for coming. I think, Mr. President, that you have probably opened a new era between the executive and the legislative departments, and I'm very happy for it.
Mr. Chairman, I want to express to you and to the other members of the committee or subcommittee my appreciation for the fine manner and I think the fair way in which this meeting was held this morning. I felt that it was absolutely essential because I'm the only one who could explain the background and the decision-making process. And I hope, as I said in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman, that have at least cleared the air so that most Americans will understand what was done and why it was done. And again, I trust that all of us can get back to the job of trying to solve our problems both at home and abroad. I thank you very, very much.
Ford claimed it was an act to heal the country, but many saw it as a betrayal of justice. It cost Ford big time. The move likely cost Ford the presidency, but it raised an enduring question. Can a pardon truly heal, or does it leave deeper scars? Some pardons, though, have been about fixing past wrongs. In 1977, Jimmy Carter pardoned over 200,000 Vietnam War draft dodgers, bringing relief to thousands who had fled the country. It was one of the biggest acts of forgiveness in presidential history. Carter said it was time to heal the wounds of a divided nation. Supporters called it bold. Critics called it a slap in the face to veterans who had served. And who could forget Bill Clinton? His presidency ended with a bang, or maybe a scandal, when on his last day in office, he pardoned Mark Rich, a billionaire fugitive. Rich was wanted for tax evasion and trading with Iran during a U.S. embargo. The backlash, huge. Rich's pardon led to investigations and allegations of impropriety. People were asking, was this really about justice, or was there something else going on behind the scenes? Was it an act of compassion or a favor for political allies? Clinton defended his choice, but it left a stain on his legacy. George W. Bush made headlines too when he commuted the sentence of Scooter Libby, a top aide to Vice President Dick Cheney. Libby had been convicted of leaking a CIA agent's identity. Bush stopped short of a full pardon, but it still sparked outrage. And in more recent history, Barack Obama issued a record number of commutations for nonviolent drug offenders. It was part of his push for criminal justice reform. To many, it was a step toward fixing a broken system. To others, it felt like letting people off the hook.
Sentences of 46 nonviolent criminals. He says the punishment did not fit the crime. Many of the commuted sentences involved lengthy terms for nonviolent crimes involving crack cocaine. This week, the White House is launching several policy initiatives focused on making the criminal justice system in this nation fairer.
But I believe that at its heart, America is a nation of second chances. And I believe these folks deserve their second chance. I also believe there's a lot more we can do to restore the sense of fairness at the heart of our justice system and to make sure our tax dollars are well spent, even as we are keeping our streets safe. That's something I'm going to discuss tomorrow in Philadelphia, where I'm going to lay out some ideas for criminal justice reform, many of which are already getting bipartisan support. Together, we can make our communities safer. We can spend our taxpayer dollars more wisely, and we can make sure that more of our citizens, even those who've made mistakes, have a chance to become productive members of society and contribute to this country that we love.
One of Barack Obama's more surprising pardons was for Oscar Lopez Rivera, a Puerto Rican nationalist convicted of plotting bombings to push for Puerto Rican independence. Lopez Rivera had spent 35 years in prison when Obama commuted his sentence in 2017. The decision sparked heated debates about the line between activism and terrorism. Then came Donald Trump, who turned pardons into primetime drama. His list included celebrities like Lil Wayne and Kodak Black, controversial figures like Joe Arpaio, and even Steve Bannon, his former advisor. Critics said he used pardons to reward loyalty.
So this is
Trump said he
January
was
6th.
righting wrongs. Sometimes, pardons come too late. In 2020, President Donald Trump posthumously pardoned Susan B. Anthony, the famous women's suffrage leader. She had been convicted of illegally voting in the 1872 presidential election. The pardon was symbolic, but it reignited debates about the role of historical pardons in modern politics. Love him or hate him, Trump's pardons definitely grabbed attention. At its core, the pardon is about forgiveness. But who deserves it? And when does it go too far? The power to pardon is a symbol of the presidency's ultimate authority. As history has shown, each pardon tells a story, not just of the individual who was forgiven, but of the nation's values and its struggle to balance mercy with accountability. From soldiers and activists to bootleggers and billionaires, the stories behind presidential pardons reveal a lot about the values of a leader and the times they live in. Some pardons unite the country, others divide it. But every one of them reminds us of the incredible power and responsibility of the presidency. They've been used to heal wounds, settle scores, and sometimes leave us scratching our heads. But one thing's for sure, they'll always be one of the most fascinating powers of the presidency.